So The Cure is one of my absolute all-time favorite bands, and they're one of my favorites for a lot of different reasons, really. I love the fact that they're masters of all kinds of different styles. You know, they have crazy, you know, silly, poppy, let's go to bed type stuff, and then they have moody, dark, post-punky, gothic stuff. And they're able to create songs that are super catchy and get stuck in your head, and they're also able to create songs that are atmospheric and lush and just sound like an experience, basically. So if you've never listened to The Cure before, it's not really fair to label them as a goth rock band exclusively, but at the same time, they're not just some poppy alternative band. They lie somewhere in between. Or rather, it might be more accurate to say that they jump back and forth between different styles as opposed to just staying in one spot. And I'm not talking about simply evolving and moving from one place to the next. I'm talking about literally just going back and forth between different styles and experimenting a lot. This isn't a Siouxsie and the Banshees situation. With Siouxsie and the Banshees, I feel like they kind of started off as post-punky and gothy, but then they kind of evolved past that and they became more of an alternative pop band, or if you want to call it that. But with The Cure, I feel like it's almost wrong to label certain albums as more gothy and certain albums as more poppy, because oftentimes they're mixed together. If you look at Wish, for instance, you have poppy tracks such as Friday I'm in Love and Windy Time doing The Unstuck, but then you also have darker, sadder tracks like Trust or To Wish Impossible Things. I mean, the very first song on the record is Open, which is about alcoholism. And so I think The Cure are very good at exploring a wide range of moods and encompassing a lot of different feelings in one package. And I feel like that's kind of what they do on their self-titled album from 2004. This record is something of a novelty, I feel like, because you have The Cure, which are one of the greatest alternative rock bands ever, and they paired with Ross Robinson, I believe is his name, who is a nu metal producer. He produced the first Korn album and the first Slipknot album, and basically nu metal is what he's known for. And so it's a very odd pairing to pair The Cure with him. And I think just because of the fact that the pairing is so strange, it was always bound to yield interesting results. And I think that's what this album is I think it's interesting. Is it a great album? No, I don't think so. The Cure's self-titled album is not one of my favorites, but again, I think it's interesting and I think it's worth taking the time to look at. I looked into the reception of this album a bit, and I found it very interesting because if you look at reviews from whenever it first came out in 2004, it got pretty positive reviews. You know, people liked it, you know, and if you read any kind of message boards or anything from back then, people dug it. People enjoyed the self-titled record. But if you look at it now, 20 years later, people don't like it. People don't care about this album. Some people act like this album is completely trash, and quite frankly, I don't think that's fair. But also at the same time, looking at the old reviews from 2004, I don't think that it's as good as some of the people were saying it is. And so what makes this album stand out from other Cure albums? What makes it special or distinct? The production, really, I think is what it boils down to. And like I said, I think the pairing between the nu metal producer and The Cure is what makes the album interesting and worth looking at, because it's not a nu metal record, you know, not by any means. But I don't think this album really can be confused with any of The Cure's classic stuff. It has a very distinct sound. In an interview about this album, Robert Smith, the lead singer of The Cure, described it as Cure heavy as opposed to nu metal heavy. And I think that's right. You know, basically it is a heavier version of The Cure. This album isn't heavy in the same way that something like doom metal is, for instance, but I think that it is heavy in its own special way. So The Cure is an interesting band because they've been a 3-piece before, but at this point they're a 6-piece, and so they just have all these different instruments playing at any given moment. But really, I think the dominant sound on this album is the sound of the guitars. And you know, this is a rock album, right? Like, so that's not anything surprising. But this album is mixed in a really strange way, to my ears at least, and the keyboards sound very suppressed. They're very, very low in the mix, you know, whereas the guitars and the bass are very high up, and they're very loud and they're very noisy. I think that the poor mixing of this album, and I do think it is poor mixing, is apparent most readily on the very first track on the album, which is Lost. Lost was actually one of my favorite tracks on the album, but the mixing of it has always bothered me because it starts off kind of slow, you know, with only a little bit of guitar and vocals, and then it kind of explodes into a full band playing. But the problem is that the instruments on this track don't blend together. They don't mesh together nicely. They sound like they're clashing together. And I feel like they sound like they're fighting for dominance almost. And I don't know what it is, but like, the mixing isn't as bad on the rest of the album as it is on this one song. There's just something about it that's super confusing to me, and it makes the song hard to listen to. With that being said, I still like the song, actually. I still enjoy it. And honestly, I have mixed feelings about the song because, like I'm saying, I feel like the mixing on it is very bad, but also I wonder if that was purposeful because it seems to mesh really well with Robert Smith's lyrics about feeling lost and not being able to find himself. And it kind of feels a little bit disorienting, I think. Because like I said, by the end of the song, the entire band is playing and it just sounds like a mess. And that kind of works with the lyric. But with that being said, even if that were the case, even if the mixing were purposefully messy because of the lyrics, I don't know that that makes it a good song. I mean, it's a song I like, but at the same time, it's kind of hard to listen to. And I don't mean that in a good way. And I don't even mean it in a way where sometimes you'll hear a new album or you'll hear a new style of music and it's completely foreign to you and it takes some adjusting to get used to. I don't even mean it like that. I just mean that it just sounds like a mess. The next track on the album is Labyrinth, which sounds to me like something off of Bloodflowers almost. The song lyrically is very interesting because Robert Smith basically divided the song into two parts almost. In the first part, he sings about how things are the same. For instance, it's the same sun spinning in the same sky, the same stars streaming in the same night. And so you just kind of hear that this is the same, the house is the same, the boy is the same, the bed is the same, and he goes through all these things that are all the same. But then by the end of it, it kind of turns into a thing to where even though everything seems familiar, it's not as it seems, and it's actually quite startling and weird, and some of the imagery is really interesting. And so this song isn't one of my favorites, but I kind of respect it for just doing something interesting. To me, it almost feels less like a song and more like a story is being told. So like I mentioned earlier, I feel like a lot of Cure albums are kind of a split between the sadder, darker stuff and the more upbeat poppy stuff, and I think that's what this album is. I think the first two songs, Lost and Labyrinth, that I was just talking about, fall squarely into the darker, sadder stuff, or whatever you want to call them. I'm not going to discuss every song on the album, but I wanted to acknowledge that to me the album appears to be split into two types of songs. The 4-3 and The End of the World I think are both clearly more poppy songs. You know, The End of the World is a minor hit for the Cure, I guess we'll say. It's not a huge hit like Just Like Heaven is, but at the same time they still play it live to this day, and really that's the only song that you can say that about off this album. But these songs to me sound like classic Cure. As someone who's listened to pretty much everything the Cure has ever done, or has tried to at least, these songs feel familiar to me. But there's a twist, which is the production. Again, this is the Cure's heavy album, and so even though these are pop songs, they sound a little bit heavier than most of their others do. You know, this isn't the Love Cats we're talking about here. The production isn't as clean as something like that. It's a lot more muddled. And the reason I'm not going to discuss every song in detail is because I feel like what I just said applies to probably half the album. You know, it sounds like classic Cure, but the production makes it sound a little bit different to where it's not the same as classic Cure. And so when this album came out, nu metal was big, right? Slipknot was big, Korn was big, Deftones, System of a Down, all that stuff. And a lot of it's angry, right? You know, that's just kind of the way metal is. You know, you're not going to be screaming and yelling whenever you're happy necessarily, right? And like I said at the beginning of this, I really don't think that the Cure were going for nu metal with this album, because honestly it's not nu metal. It doesn't even sound like nu metal. But if the band was influenced in any way, shape, or form by nu metal, then I think it's most apparent on the song Us or Them. So angry is not a word I normally associate with the Cure. Sad, happy, atmospheric, depressing, upbeat, silly, fun, goofy. These are words I would associate with the Cure. Angry is not one of them. I find it really difficult to even think of Cure songs that are angry, quite frankly. I think you can argue that Pornography is definitely an angry album. You know, I mean, it literally starts off with the line, "It doesn't matter if we all die." And then I think that the very first song off of Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, The Kiss, I think it's the angriest I've heard Robert Smith, except for on this song. On this song, Robert Smith seems to be railing against people who are closed-minded or intolerant or bigots, which he straight up says the word bigots. And he's not just angry, he's straight up pissed off. He doesn't want people trampling on his freedom of speech, basically, is my interpretation of it. He doesn't want anyone's religion shoved down his throat. He doesn't want to be made to believe certain things. I think this is one of the best songs off the album just because it's interesting. Like I'm trying to get across, the Cure are not known for being angry, they're not known for being bitter, but I feel like resentment definitely comes across with this track. A couple of years ago, the Cure released some live albums for their 40th anniversary, and one of them was the Curation 25 disc. That album's interesting because it's a concert that is essentially composed of deep cuts, and this song shows up on there, but I hate it. I like live albums, but I don't enjoy this version of it, and the reason why is because it's lacking the passion and drive of the original. On the live recording, it sounds like Robert Smith is just kind of going with the flow, you know, and he might have just been having an off day, but he doesn't seem impassioned at all. And really, I think that is what makes this song work, is his passion. In the studio version, he gives a super powerful vocal performance. Right, and I love this dude's voice. I think that he sounds good on just about anything, but I love this performance in particular just because he showcases a range of emotion that you don't often see from him. Alt End is my favorite of the pop songs off this album, and he sings about not wanting another go-around. Robert Smith has threatened that the next Cure album will be their last since pretty much 1982, and apparently he threatened that this album, the self-titled record, would be their last. It wasn't. You know, they came out with a record after that, and they're supposed to be coming out with a new one, but if you believe that this self-titled album would be their last, then I could see it, honestly. I feel like I haven't talked about the lyrics that much, and honestly the reason why is because with a lot of the songs it feels like lyrically they're about falling in love or falling out of love, just love in general. You know, and that's great. One of The Cure's greatest songs is called Love Song. A lot of it just kind of feels like territory that we've already passed through, and so because of that, the lyrics just don't stand out to me. I don't think these are Robert Smith's best lyrics. You know, he can be very abstract and weird and crazy. Look at Pornography, for instance. But then I think he knows how to evoke specific emotions. I'm thinking of the song Homesick off of Disintegration, which for me brings about a sense of melancholy and longing, and it really taps into something special, I think. So a lot of the songs on this album have kind of blah lyrics, but honestly anything Robert Smith sings will sound good. So there's always that. I Don't Know What's Going On and Taking Off are both pop songs through and through. Never is the second to last song on the American edition of this album, and honestly it's one of my least favorite songs that The Cure's ever done. It just doesn't sound right to me, and I wish I could put it into words better than that, but honestly I don't want to listen to the song more. I think it's probably the only song on the album that I just outright dislike and don't enjoy at all. And then the last song on the American edition of the album is The Promise, which is like 10 minutes long. Honestly, The Promise doesn't really work for me, and I think that the reason why is just because it doesn't have enough of an atmosphere to really justify its length. It's not interesting enough to fill up 10 minutes. You know, The Cure have done plenty of long songs before. You know, there's The Same Deep Water as You and Watching Me Fall. Disintegration, the title track of Disintegration, is like 8 minutes long. But I think that all of these tracks have something in common, which is they're very good at sucking you in with their atmosphere. Like I was talking about, they're very good at evoking a specific mood, but The Promise doesn't really have that going for it. It's quite a noisy song. The song it reminds me most of is The Kiss, which I mentioned earlier, and I feel like The Promise is kind of trying to do the same thing that The Kiss did. The Kiss, I think, is a song that's really interesting because it's essentially like a 7-minute long guitar solo with some vocals at the end. That's not exactly right, you know, there are drums and bass and everything else, but the part that you really focus on is the guitar playing. And that's kind of what I thought about The Promise. You know, there's this really, really noisy guitar coming through in the left ear, and I feel like that is what my focus is always drawn to whenever I listen to this song. And the song The Kiss, I think, is kind of structured around the guitar, and the song knows that the guitar is the focus of the song. But with The Promise, it feels like the entire band is just trying to play, and then you just have this one guitarist that's doing some crazy stuff. And so like I was saying about Lost earlier, I feel like the instruments on this song, as opposed to working together and trying to make the song itself better, are competing and are trying to outdo each other. I will say though, one thing I do like about this song is the vocals and the lyrics. The lyrics are pretty simple. Robert Smith is just singing about how he was promised certain things which were not delivered on. And honestly, it reminds me a lot of the song Terrible Lie by 9 Inch Nails. But I mean, at the end of the day, if the instrumental track doesn't work for you, then the song doesn't work for you, I think. And so maybe this is a song that I'll look back on in 5 or 10 years and I'll go, oh hey, this is awesome. But for me, right now, it just doesn't really work. And so if you have the American edition of the album, which is on Spotify for me, that is the end of the album. It ends with The Promise. But every other country in the world, it's Going Nowhere. Going Nowhere, I think, is freaking great. And I think the song Going Nowhere actually ties the album together lyrically really nicely. Because again, a lot of the songs on the album are about love or falling in and out of love, and it's fine. I don't love it, but it's fine. But then the more interesting song lyrics tend to be despairing and uncertain, and it sounds like Robert Smith is struggling with his place in the world. And so that brings us to Going Nowhere, which is where he sings about how he is going nowhere. And he doesn't mean that in a triumphant, I'm so great, I'm sticking around kind of way. He means it as in a, I'm not moving forward kind of way. And I think that's one thing that makes the song really powerful to me, is it's very easy to kind of write a song about a strong emotion. You know, it's really easy to be angry, it's really easy to be sad or happy, or overjoyed, or any of those emotions. But it's harder, I think, to write a compelling song that is about being unsure. And I think that's what this song is I think it's a very compelling song about being uncertain and just not really knowing what you're doing. And I think the lyrics are super simple, actually. They're very short. You know, the vocals are only a small section of the song, but there's just something very heartbreaking about their delivery. And so Going Nowhere, if it were actually on the album, would be the best song on the album easily. Now, with that being said, if you're in like Europe, then you got the song on the album. It's just North America that got screwed for some reason. So I always do this with The Cure in particular. I always like listening to their B-sides because, quite frankly, some of their B-sides are better than the stuff that's on the actual album. And so I was wondering if that was the case for this record. The B-sides that were released are Why Can't I Be Me, Your God Is Fear, Fake, and This Morning. And honestly, I don't really care for any of them. And so to sum this album up, there are sad songs on here and there are happy songs on here, but really everything is kind of a little bit muddled sounding just because of the production on this album. So is it heavy? Kind of, a little bit. It's heavier than a normal Cure album, but again, I don't think it's a heavy album. You know, you're not going to be headbanging to this or anything. But I do think this is a very interesting record in The Cure's discography. You know, most of all because they tried something new. They teamed up with a new metal producer, and that brought about a different sounding Cure album. This is a really weird thing to say, but I feel like this is, in a lot of ways, The Cure's Saint Anger album. And I like this album more than Saint Anger, but still I feel like the comparison is somewhat valid. Both records are albums that were released by major 80s artists, kind of trying to stay hip with the times to a certain extent. Again, I think Metallica did that more than The Cure did. And so in conclusion, is this a good record? I think so, but I don't think it's a super good record. If you'd never listened to The Cure before, I would not recommend this album to you first. Not at all. You know, I would say go for Disintegration, go for The Head on the Door. But if you're like me and you're a longtime Cure fan, then I think this album is kind of a breath of fresh air. So I want to make it super clear how I feel about this album. Is this my favorite Cure album? No. Is this in my top 5 favorite Cure albums? No. Is this in my top 10 favorite Cure albums though? Also no. This is my 11th favorite Cure album. And so if I had to rate this album, I would give it like a 6 out of 10 or something like that. I think it's good and I think it's worth listening to at least for a bit because I think it's a super interesting album. But yeah, even though I like this record a lot more than I did a month ago, this isn't a record that I see getting much play in the future. Certain tracks I will continue to listen to. Before 3 I really like, Alt End is great, The End of the World isn't bad. Going Nowhere is something I will definitely keep on listening to. But yeah, the album I think is just a bit of a mess and that's what makes it interesting to me. But yeah, thanks for watching this. No one's gonna watch this. Like, I have no illusions about this. This is a weird freaking review, and I'm still not sure why I did it other than just I wanted to. Because let's be honest, like, who is supposed to be watching this video? Because let's be real about this. The Cure self-titled record is not good enough to be remembered as great, but at the same time, it's not bad enough to be remembered as infamously as Saint Anger is. Like I've said, I don't really feel like they knocked this one out of the park, but at the same time, I still think that they did something interesting enough to look back on every now and then. And so really, I think that's just all I have to say about the album, is that it's worth checking out every now and then. And so if you've stuck around this long, thank you for watching. Again, no one's gonna watch this freaking video. This video is gonna get 1 view and it's you. So thank you for watching. Have a nice night.